Turn on any news on radio or television and you will hear experts giving their take on any and every question that is being asked. These talking heads are everywhere. They are loud, boisterous, and argumentative. It does not matter what subject is the topic of that moment. They spew noise loudly as if their loudness would allow their views to be heard. They do not seem to think and ponder when questions are asked. Rather, they accuse someone who takes a moment or two to think about a question as hesitant, unsure, trying to wiggle a way out, deceive, spin, or lie. It is as if humans should be like computers, that whatever we put in has to show something right away in response. People are talking past each other, even in answering. No one is listening. Everyone is presenting her own view as the only worthwhile one. How did we get here? In my early school days, many teachers taught us to think before answering. In some cases, we were even told that silence is golden. There was no need for everyone to say something all the time in those days. Now, we live in a world where a quick and fast response is valued far more than deep thinking among those pundits on public airwaves. In those early days, it was also important to learn that if we had important things to say, then we needed to use the right tones of voice to convey what we were saying. There were times when loudness was called for, but not on every occasion. Even more, expressing anger and annoyance in public was seen as immature. Today, everyone who has important things to say seems to be loud all the time. Also, we were taught to listen. Yes, we had to listen carefully and respectfully before we said something. Today, interrupting people who are talking is part of the conversation. Everyone interrupts loudly. Often it is clear no one is listening to anyone when they want to say something. Again, how did we get here? I cannot pinpoint to when this began. Looking back, I could see changes, especially watching Americans. As civil rights movement began in full force and as demonstrations against the war in Vietnam became louder and louder, we could see how the powerful ignored and refused to listen to the powerless and the masses. The civil rights protests became loud after being suppressed and silenced for 200 years in the United States. They had to be loud, not in voices, but in actions. As the police began unleashing violence against peaceful civil rights protesters like Dr. King and others, many youth began to realize that in order to overcome the powers, they had to shout loudly above and beyond the press and the ruling hierarchy, who did not hesitate to silence them, nor to listen to them. Soon, demonstrations against war in Vietnam became loud in sounds and actions. Actions of both protesters and suppressors were loudly fought out, not only on streets but also on television. By the early 1990s, many civil discourses in the United States became very loud everywhere. With the proliferations of 24-hour cable news stations coming into Canada from the United States, many Canadians learned that high emotional clashes and verbal fights could draw a large audience. We are still quieter than Americans, but there are many in Canada who have learned that loud voices can win. Many civil disobedient actions became loud in Canada, just like in the United States and other countries. We may not be loud in our discussions and debates like Americans, as evidenced in our political debates during elections and in our television shows. But that does not mean we listen. We are as bad as listening to each other as Americans. Yes, being Canadian means to wait for our turn to speak, but waiting for our turns to speak does not mean that we necessarily listen carefully and think before we let our views be known. Why are we so loud in voice and actions during protest? A philosopher, whose name I have forgotten, said in an interview that the voice of the oppressed rises to heaven when it is not heard on earth. That is, when the powers that be ignore voices of the poor, the weak, and the oppressed as they plead, their voices grow louder and louder in hope that if the earthly powers will not hear them, at least the heavenly power will hear their plight. The art of conversation, we were taught, had two parts: listening respectfully and offering thoughtful responses. Neither of these two components are present in today's public discourses. It is all about how important my view is regardless of what others say. The most valuable lesson was to learn to be respectful if we were to listen. In this sense, hearing was different than listening. In listening, we would pay attention and do our best to understand what others were saying to us. Only when we fully understood, this understanding could be achieved when we give full respect to a speaker. We could form our responses. This teaching is totally lost today. People are insisting that they be respected without respecting others. They want others to hear their views, but they do not pay any attention to what others have to say to us. Naturally, our voices rise when we think others are not listening to us. The loudness of our voice is our natural reaction when others are not paying attention to what we have to say. Our public debates, be they political or on other subjects, have become nothing more than shouting fests where people loudly speak past each other instead of stopping what we have to say and listen. In the past few decades, we have grown to be less respectful of others and to be more insistent on forcing others to hear what we have to say. Those of us who grew up in churches grew up with the knowledge that if we do not have something wise to share, we ought to refrain from saying anything. The passage from Ecclesiastes reflects perfectly our understanding of being wise versus being foolish. In today's world, this gem makes absolutely no sense to all those people who want to let the world know why their views are the only ones worth considering. To justify their views, they quote, they recall, and borrow from others of note from whatever sources that are available. Not many people display abilities to listen deeply and respond to very basic need of others with whom they are speaking. It sounds as if we ought to accept someone's view simply because the person is able to produce high academic credentials and vast skills to quote so many research results. This kind of behavior has now been disseminated to everyone in every country. We see it in various groups on fringes doing exactly the same thing in terms of expressing themselves to be taken seriously while refusing to listen to others and be dismissive of anyone else's viewpoint. This situation has resulted in very hurtful and debilitating human conditions. When the wise speaks, no one listens. When the foolish make loud noises, everyone pays attention. Sounds of voices fill the air, yet no one is listening. Many people are crying out in pain and suffering, but there are no ears to hear and respond appropriately. Everyone is busy responding as quickly as they hear it, but only very few are listening to the deep, unquenchable sorrows. As more and more people speak past each other, sounds only get louder. In this loud cacophony of sounds, more and more people feel isolated, lonely, ignored, and unheard. They lose hope. They realize that their stories do not matter to anyone. Most of them are giving up in their troubled lives because no one cares enough to listen to their stories. The wise are no longer visible in the world filled with the foolish. Sounds of the foolish swallow up the voices of the suffering. Sounds of the foolish overwhelm the voices of the wise. In this world filled with empty talking heads, or to borrow from Paul, noisy gong or clanging cymbals, it is easy to get disoriented and lose our ways. How do we find our way back to God in this noisy world? Where is our North Star? How will we recover respect not only for ourselves but also for the world? What will take to halt people from speaking past each other? Our community was built on listening to each other, as Christ listened to women and men in their daily lives, listening to joys, delights, wonders, pains, suffering, and despairs expressed by others was a way of loving like Christ. Our Lord went from place to place listening. His ministry was based on God so loved the world. In that God's love, we see Jesus among people listening. Sure, he spoke, he taught, and argued. For the Jewish leader whose daughter was dying, for the blind man who came, for the hemophiliac woman, for women who brought children to be blessed, for the adulterous woman and her accusers, all those who came to him, Jesus listened and invited them to speak. How do we build our church in this loud and noisy place? How do we establish in the minds of all who know everything already and are constantly telling us how important and certain they are, the church that they will come to listen? What kind of church will we be in this world where no one has anything nice to say about Christian churches? What style of church will we build together when even preachers everywhere are loud, too busy to express their anger or judgment against the world? Being God's love would be a church that listens to ups and downs of each person. Being God's love that creates space for all to bring their stories, be affirmed, restored, and healed would be one way we let God's church be real to all, a safe place where the deepest secret can be spoken and held in love, a place where each person is found through words spoken and heard.